Summer routines live or die by how easy they are. And honestly, if something takes too much effort, I'm out. That's why Groons is my go-to. It's my one daily pack of gummies covering my greens, vitamins, and minerals. Plus, it has 6 grams of prebiotic fiber, which is more than 2 cups of broccoli. No mixing powders, no giant pills, no hassle. I just rip open the pack and I'm done. They taste good and they make it easy to stay on top of my health, even when life gets busy. Save up to 52% with the code PODCAST at Groons.co. That's code PODCAST at GRUNS.co.
With the Tradwife influencers, there's this tendency to really glorify the good old days in this sort of fantasy way, right? You know, churning butter and making homemade bread. And they're not showing the oppression. They're not showing the poverty. They're not showing what it was like for women and for men and for Native people who were displaced and killed and their children taken from them. You know, there were just so many harsh realities.
We are not forming authentic connection if we're so concerned about how we're presenting ourselves to be in this more aspirational way, then we're not really connecting. There is a real lack of authenticity in how these people are performing and presenting.
That was us, Debbie Sorensen and Emily Edlin, on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey listeners, just a super quick reminder that you can listen to the podcast ad-free by supporting us on Patreon for just $5 a month. Or you can support the podcast with a one-time donation on Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you to everyone who's already supporting us. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Debbie.
We are here today to talk to you about some modern-day phenomena that the two of us find fascinating: social media influencers, reality TV, and Tradwives. And Emily and I both share a concern about these things. And we see them as a problem that is relevant to our podcast because we like to talk about social justice issues and things that are going on in our culture that might potentially impact people's mental health. And so we thought we'd share a few thoughts today about this topic and some of our concerns.
So, Debbie, I remember when you approached me about this, I was so excited. This is kind of my dream come true to talk about these topics on a podcast, but with a very specific lens, you know, not just to glamorize and further sensationalize, but to really analyze. But I want to hear more from you about why you wanted to do this episode. What motivated you to make this an episode?
Well, let me tell you a quick story about something that happened months ago, which was sort of the confluence of two things. I was reading a book about the Dust Bowl. It's called The Worst Hard Time. It's a really interesting, historic nonfiction book about what happened during the Dust Bowl. And I was really interested in this book because my ancestors on my mom's side of my family lived in Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl. And I was just interested in it for more of a personal reason, just to kind of know more about my own ancestors. And during the period when I was reading that book, I read an essay about a Tradwife influencer, a very famous one, Ballerina Farm, it's called. And there's a lot written about Ballerina Farm, but that essay just happened to come into my inbox and capture my attention. So it's a farm, and it's called Ballerina Farm. And it's also a very popular social media account where this woman, Hannah Beetleman, and her husband, Daniel, and I think they have 9 kids, if I'm not mistaken. They live on a farm. They sell their products. They market them online. They have millions of social media followers. They now do tours of their farm. They have merch. They have, this whole really successful business empire doing this, right? And they're famous because of their social media account. And they are, I would say that Hannah, could be considered a trad wife in the sense that she's sort of glamorizing this lifestyle of raising kids and baking everything from scratch, that whole thing. And so anyway, what I recognized as I was looking at her account and several other tradwife accounts is that there was just kind of this discrepancy between what were being shown and reality. Anyway, I started working on an essay about this kind of juxtaposition for my Substack, which we'll link to. I just recently, finally, after months, finally posted it on Substack, and we will link to that if anyone wants to take a look at what I wrote. But over the course of these months, I was reading a lot of social commentary and really looking at a lot of these accounts, which, by the way, I am over it. I am so tired of looking at these.
Yeah, how did that affect you to spend so much time with those accounts? I'm curious.
That's a great question, Emily. I mean, I think that on the one hand, I was sort of intellectually interested in this as a phenomenon and definitely was reading a lot of criticism, as much criticism about it as I was sucked into the actual social media accounts. But I also think that it's just hard to see it. It felt a little icky, but also more importantly, it's just concerning to me for a number of reasons that we'll talk about today. And so after we do this conversation and my Substack goes out, I am ready to take a break for a while.
So let's back up a little bit, Debbie. How would you define tradwife?
I think that it's basically, trad stands, of course, for traditional. And so I think it's this portrayal of the traditional gender roles. And so there's various versions of this. And I was mostly interested in these sort of pioneering types who live on farms.
The homesteaders.
Homesteading kind of vibes, right? Lots of floral dresses and milking cows and that kind of thing. But I think just more broadly, it means people who are sort of espousing the lifestyle of traditional gender roles. Like the women are home raising kids, doing housework, cooking. Men are out earning a living. So yeah, kind of that traditional gender role.
Yeah. And I've seen some critique of it, how it's such a paradox, and maybe we'll talk about this more later, that these women promoting this very traditional female role of wife and mother are at the same time running these enormously successful businesses.
That's right. Yes, that absolutely struck me.
We will get into that. Yeah.
Yes, we'll get into that more. But in the day-to-day basis, they're actually, doing social media and running a business, not actually staying home with the kids scrubbing the toilet all day long.
Right.
Yeah. So how about you, Emily? How did you get interested in this topic and what caught your attention about it?
So I am not as into influencers. I haven't fallen down those rabbit holes yet, but I am a heavy watcher of reality TV, and I have been for a long time. Especially when I was raising young kids and I was completely exhausted. It was just a really easy, mindless way to feel some entertainment. But I have a very ambivalent relationship with reality TV because I do think it brings up similar dilemmas as influencers. There are these themes that there's this false sense of reality that make the regular person maybe feel worse about themselves because they don't measure up in terms of beauty and wealth and privilege. So I never got into the Kardashians, but I think that's the perfect example of this sort of a way of life to emulate that most of us are going to fail at, right? For many reasons. And so I do think, as with influencers and tradwives, there's this sort of false ideal that is actually impossible for most of the population. And then we start to feel worse about ourselves. When it comes to influencers, I have watched the Ruby Franke documentary, which I recommend. But this recent book, Yesteryear, by Caro Claire Burke, illustrated to me what's going on in this world. And she really gets into the dynamics and social commentary in a very creative, engaging way. So it was very thought-provoking. And another thing I find fascinating is that there's this shine of perfectionism, right, to aspire to. But I think that's dangerous, too, in the real world, in our individual lives. So I think it may sound frivolous on the surface for us to cover this topic, But I think the psychology of all of this is really important to explore.
Yeah. I have to say, it's funny because I'm not that into reality TV. I mean, I've watched some along the way over the years, but usually I just do not get sucked into it. But I recently watched one episode of, what's it called? Secret
Lives of Mormon Wives.
Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. And I watched it and I was just like, these people are horrible.
They grow on you.
So maybe I should keep watching, give it a chance.
Well, I'm not suggesting you spend your free time watching that show, but I'm just saying that that's the hook for people like me who do watch it, is that you see, I just get hooked into their humanity, but then realize it's not a full picture of who they really are. So there's the rub.
But I'm glad you mentioned this because I think we should acknowledge that there's a reason people find these accounts appealing. And I was actually thinking about that with some of the Tradwife accounts I watched and Ballerina Farm, but also other ones. And I think one of the things I enjoyed was that as I was watching them, it looked really nice, right?
Yeah,
they have this kind of slow vibe. They're calm. They're in this beautiful kitchen, making food from scratch and out there picking vegetables in their garden. Like, it really did look lovely.
Peaceful.
I think, yeah, our modern times are stressful. And so it's like, oh, this looks really lovely. I mean, I think that, and they all look nice.
Yeah. There's a visual aesthetic, right? That's very pleasing.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're not here to bash people who get into this stuff. Like, we want to acknowledge there's an entertainment value. We can view them and consume them without ruining our lives. But we also want to try to be conscious and thoughtful about the media we consume and its impact.
Yeah. And on that end, I want to talk more about this social justice lens. And I think, you kind of already noted some of the beauty standards. And I think it's really important to talk about that, right? Like, what do you mostly see in these shows and these social media accounts? It's a certain aesthetic, a certain ideal of what we are supposed to be looking like.
And what is beautiful, right? Yeah. And I think, I've done some reading and I can't cite that right now, but that really talks about how these beauty ideals have been traditionally connected with white supremacy structures, that there's this, white European ideal of beauty and value and worth. And I do think that is somewhat playing out in our modern, social media world and reality TV world. And then how does that affect the general population, right? Of how we all think about beauty.
Right. I mean, there's so much right now about that look that so many people have on TV, even just thinking about that one episode I saw of the Mormon Wives show and how they all looked a certain way. They weren't all white, but most of them are white, and they have that certain very thin sort of look about them. And
and the one that gets me is the hair extensions going for miles on all of these women, so much hair, really long. Do you know how many hours and dollars it would take to keep up that hair? But it comes across as just my hair, even though they do have some scenes of the extensions, but it's just I think it's a good metaphor for what this all is. Yeah. It takes a lot of work and resources to look this way, but there's this effortlessness in how it's presented.
Right. And so you could think about that in terms of standards, and especially for young people consuming this content. I think it goes without saying, too, that there's a lot about gender roles and patriarchy in these images as well, in these videos, right? I think sometimes they're overtly encouraging traditional gender roles and these sort of gender-based expectations and stereotypes. And sometimes it's a little more subtle. They're not necessarily saying that they want this to be the world that we live in, but I think it's a little bit implied in what they're showing them. And I think sort of, just this backlash that we're in right now, where it's like, okay, get women back into the kitchen, keep them oppressed. They shouldn't be out there having jobs and voting, and just the dependency that creates for women on men for financial stability, not to mention fulfillment. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of women who do find that lifestyle fulfilling, and that's great. But I think there's a lot who are not fulfilled by that. And so clearly there's plenty of concerns from like a sexism and patriarchy perspective.
Absolutely. And I know in my interview in another episode with Joanne Finkelstein about her book about raising girls, Sexism and Sensibility, she cites some sociological research showing that when women are gaining power in society, whether that's being in the workplace more, getting paid more, getting more college degrees, that there is a synchronous uptick in the pressure to be extra thin and beautiful, and ways to spend our energy that is not helping us gain value in the external world, right? It's keeping us focused on what's wrong with us, what are our flaws. And I think, obviously, this whole landscape that you and I are talking about today does function that way. Even if, like me, I participated in it as entertainment, the messages are still there pretty loud and clear.
Which is part of why I think we wanted to do this episode, because I think the more you see it and see it for what it is, you can either choose not to watch it or watch it, but aware that that's sort of the subtle messaging going on. And then you can not feel as much pressure to be pulled into that.
Yeah. And of course, I have to bring in the parenting perspective, which is, I have 2 teenage daughters who are consuming these media, and actually, they're the reason I started watching Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. I kind of wanted to know what they were into. And it is really good conversation for us to have.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to say you can't watch it. That's just not going to work, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh no, I don't want you taking in this content, right? Don't do it. That's just not realistic. But instead, we can have pretty thoughtful conversations if I am aware of the media.
My daughters watched Dance Moms. And
yes.
I would go down there to tell them to stop or to go do something else with their time, and I'd get sucked into it. So I didn't watch the whole thing, but I would catch episodes with them. And we had so many conversations about, especially the dance teacher.
Oh, yes.
Abby
Who is
Miller.
abusive. I'm like, abusive.
And at first I would say to them, is this teaching you to be like this? And they're always like, no, Mom.
I know.
But it gave us a lot to talk about in terms of what's a healthy way to interact with children. So we already mentioned this, and I want to go back to it because it's something I really unpack in the Substack essay I wrote. I think with the Tradwife influencers, there's this tendency to really glorify the good old days in this sort of fantasy way, right? They take the good parts of the good old day, churning butter and making homemade bread and all this, all this stuff. But for the, we don't have video, but Emily just did a eye roll. I could see her on the video. So noted. But, they don't acknowledge the harsh downsides of these supposedly good old days, right? They're not showing the oppression. They're not showing the poverty. They're not showing what it was like for women and for men and for Native people who were displaced and killed and their children taken from them and all. There were just so many harsh realities to it. And I think here in the United States, we really do glorify kind of this Western idealism and homesteading and pioneering. And this happens in my family. These are my ancestors. And so, we kind of have pride around that. But I think sometimes when we're looking at it through that lens, we forget that it was not great. It destroyed the environment. It was really bad for a lot of people. And most people were in a very dire situation. They were struggling. This was not a beautiful life.
It's not glamorous at all. Yeah. And I think if those people were alive today, they would say, no, I would never go back to that. I mean, that's my guess, right? That they would prefer the modern day conveniences in some ways rather than that harsh way of life. And I know this mostly from reading yesteryear, but the way it's portrayed as easy and effortless is where the real lie is, too.
Yes. Well, and one thing that I noticed about a lot of the Tradwife social media accounts, they have this weird thing about making cereal from scratch. Like Cocoa Puffs and Rice Krispies and Cinnamon Toast. I don't know why this is a whole thing. They just spend hours doing this. And it's really strange to me because my grandparents, they would never have done that. They would not spend 4 hours or however long it takes making. They would go buy breakfast cereal, you know? And I saw a social media post, which I linked to in my Substack essay, so you can check it out if you're interested, where they talk about there's a privilege to this, right? Like people who are actually in these roles, they are doing the real work of domestic labor. And so there's like this sort of privilege to be able to do something like make Cinnamon Toast Crunch cereal from scratch.
For 4 hours, for half of a workday.
And film it and put it on social media, right? Like that is not the actual work that people are doing who are in, you know, really traditional roles like this. And so they have people doing that stuff for them. Or this is their job. You could look at this as their job. And so there's just that sense of like privilege underneath it and sort of this glorification of that. I mean, people would probably make oatmeal or something like that takes not that much time, but they were not doing things like that.
Because why? You know, I don't know why there's a aspirational quality to that. But anyway.
It's performative.
It's performative. Yes.
Which I think leads us to something else that we wanted to talk about, which is that performative nature of it and sort of the authenticity of what we see on social media versus real life and real authentic problems people are having and how that might lead to more of a disconnection and loneliness.
Yes, this is something that I worry about a lot, is how there is a real lack of authenticity in how these people are performing and presenting. But then it becomes the ideal that we feel like as the consumers, even if it's subconscious, you know, aspiring to. But then how does that make us feel like we can't present authentically with all of our literal wrinkles and flaws and struggle? So I think this is really important to pay attention to. And we've sort of talked about how you were touching on, they are running a business, these influencers, of living a domestic life, but this is how they're earning their income.
That's right.
And they often have a whole team of people you do not see on camera that are helping them run this business.
That's right. Well, and I think, you know, to sort of pick on Ballerina Farm again, to even start the business that they have requires a lot of financial privilege, right? So they bought this multi-million-dollar farm in their 20s. They got it off the ground. We don't see that. We don't see the financial privilege behind it. And I don't know the details of their situation, but as I was researching for my essay, I got into some interesting stuff about modern day agriculture, which I would have not thought I would be interested in, but it was really fascinating and sad because I think most people who are actually running farms these days, small family farms, they are struggling. Most of them are not making it right now.
Yeah.
It's very hard to maintain that. And so really what they're doing well is branding and advertising and marketing. And so they're selling these premium products that they're luxury goods, right? And there's this idea of aspirational spending, how we see this beautiful, you know, former ballerina with all these kids living this beautiful farm lifestyle. And so we'll spend $70 on the protein powder she's selling, or I'm not sure that's how much that actually costs, but it's in that ballpark. Or, you know, this cutting board that's artisan crafted that costs $250. And there's this sense of, you know, I want a life like that. And so I'm going to do these little things I can afford because I can't afford to buy a multi-million-dollar farm and live off the land like that. That's actually quite hard for people to do.
Yeah. For 99.99% of the population to do. And I do think it is a disservice to those farmers who are, you know, barely getting by, working, you know, from dawn till after dusk. And it's a really hard lifestyle. And I think it is a disservice to their real lived experience as well.
That's
to kind of promote this.
Well, I'm thinking just in terms of like the mental health impact, right? It's like life is hard. We all struggle. And sometimes when we see these idealized versions of things that are only part of the story, we can start to we can internalize those expectations and start to feel a little bit like, what's wrong with me? Or why is this hard for me? And why am I struggling? And so to me, there's that awareness of the mental health impact that people have, not just in terms of body standards, but also these unrealistic standards of how we should be living our lives.
I agree. And I know, on our podcast, we do a lot of episodes that center on how critical social relationships are to health and well-being all over the map, right? Like every outcome is affected by social relationships, including lifespan and overall psychological health and well-being. But I think that what I worry about is that we are not forming authentic connection if we're so concerned about how we're presenting ourselves to be in this more aspirational way, then we're not really connecting. And then that's part of, we have this whole loneliness epidemic we keep talking about, and how people aren't as socially connected as they were in the past. And there's a lot of factors contributing to that.
Absolutely. And I think that we know from experience and also from all the science on this that one of the ways we connect with people is through vulnerability and being real and being authentic and talking about our problems and sharing what's really going on.
Yeah. And an Instagram reel is not the place to do that, right? There's
True.
also that where there's sort of this. Then sometimes when people do it, it feels performative rather than genuine. And it's also questionable to have your deepest, darkest moment in front of thousands of people, right? So
Yes.
There's that too.
Yeah. It makes sense that you're not necessarily showing that. I just hope that the effect on people is that they're aware of that there is a whole reality behind the scenes. And I know I've said this on the podcast before, but I'll say it again, that one thing I find helpful is that I just imagine them with this team of people or setting up their own camera for themselves, because they might not have a team, but in that case, they have
a lot more work.
They have a lot more work. They're editing it. They're doing take after take after take to get it right. They're clearing the clutter out of the background. They're spending a lot of time on their hair and makeup. So, I like to remember that because I think it just looks like, oh, I'm just going about my daily life. This is like no big deal. But the reality is not that. It is a ton of work to produce that kind of content.
So you just envision that in your head when you see these picture perfect reels. And it reminds me of the Ruby Franke documentary. If people don't know who that is, she was a very, very popular parenting influencer that ascribed to very strict parenting. And she had a huge YouTube following. She was making 6 digits a month from her YouTube. And it turns out she was very severely abusing her children, and more evidence came out. She ended up in prison. But they had so much video footage in the documentary of what was happening between the actual takes of what ended up being published that you saw the reality of all that went into just shooting and all of the conflict, how Ruby talked to her children in between those takes. It was really alarming.
I think that people need to keep that in mind, right? This truly is performative and you're just seeing glimpses. This is not real life. And I think remembering that really helps you from getting into that place of social comparison that can be so upsetting to see.
Well, and I also think beyond like the famous people, there's even our friends, we might think, oh, they're living perfect lives based on what they post on social media. But to really look at maybe the families you know really well and realize how much is missing and apply that to every single person posting.
Yeah, it's the highlights reel, as they say. Yeah. It's not the full story. So I think another problem that's going on here, and I know that we've talked about this, we've actually done an episode before really diving into this, but there's just so much pseudoscience that we're seeing perpetrated out there, especially on social media these days. And a lot of the people that we see are hawking something, right? There's a lot of grifters out there, and they're kind of putting on these, and I think this is a big problem in the wellness world. People are talking about, they're making pseudoscientific claims. They're talking about this in a way that really, they're trying to sell us something. And I think in order to do that, they have to sort of scare us a little bit, right? So there's so much fear mongering and just really trying to appeal to our desire to improve ourselves and to be healthy and to have some semblance of control over our lives, which is so hard to find these days. But how often do you look at one of these and in the comments, it's like, here's my special code to buy this product I'm selling for whatever the latest cleanse or supplement or whatever.
Yeah. And it really is so prolific right now. I mean, I will just share that we have gotten a lot of inquiries for supplement companies making these wild claims that I know enough to know this is not scientifically supported. And unfortunately, the way the United States runs is the FDA do not have to prove their claims. There's a little bit of softening language, like they have to use certain words, but basically they can make all these claims and still sell the products that actually do nothing. And I highly recommend another podcast if you're ever not listening to our podcast, called Maintenance Phase, and they debunk a lot of the wellness trends by going through the science. And so for all of you interested in science, a science-based analysis of these trends, and they're hilarious and they swear a lot. So
I love
careful with little ears.
It's a really good one. And also often you don't realize it, but many times they're actually part of a multi-level marketing scheme. And so you might not know it, but they're actually usually selling something as one of these programs. And the parent company will tell them you can't make these health claims, but they do it anyway. And nobody seems to be monitoring what they're posting on social media.
Regulating that. Yeah.
And Emily, what's that podcast called? I know we've both listened to it where they talk about multi-level marketing.
Oh, The Dream.
The Dream. Yes, that's it. You told me about it. It's so good because it really made me aware of something that I didn't. I mean, in The Dream, she gets into all kinds of topics, but really it starts out with this idea of multi-level marketing and how people are sold a bill of goods around how much money they're going to make off these things.
Yeah. I think it's actually parallel to what we're talking about because it's selling a dream.
Yeah.
Right. And the dream of financial security and abundance.
Yeah.
For doing very little work. And that's never the case.
No. In fact, sadly, often people are financially ruined by investing so much money in these. They're told that they're going to make a fortune and they don't.
And who is the most targeted demographic?
Tell us.
Women.
Yeah.
Moms.
Yeah.
At home with their kids looking to make some money.
Well, and my grandmother sold Tupperware. And which was one of the original. And actually, in that era, that was one of the few options that women had for work. And she actually did quite well at it. She would have these Tupperware parties. She would cook all this food and bring it to her friends, and they would buy Tupperware. So maybe it started from a place that actually supported women.
And it worked. Yeah.
But it's sort of gone off the rails. These ways that are really quite, upsetting. And so I think I'm a more savvy consumer now because I'll often look at the comments or I'll look at what people are posting and I'll kind of see this code for how you can buy the products that they're selling us. And I immediately am like, oh, this is a multi-level marketing scheme. It actually just makes me a little more savvy, I think, to have learned about this.
Yeah, I think that's important for all listeners and viewers of all of this to just have that consumer brain, informed consumer brain. I also want to make sure before we run out of time that we get to the specific problem of mental health influencers.
Ooh, that's a big one. And I know we've also talked about this on the podcast a few times as well, but yes.
So there are a lot of ways now to just pop up on a platform and share opinions and information, but these people are not necessarily experts and, in fact, may not even have formal training in mental health. So, like, what are you noticing with this, Debbie?
Well, I get a little upset about it sometimes because I know so many people who are doing really, really good quality, nuanced, evidence-based work in our field. And they're often struggling to get a book contract or sell books or promote their business or whatever. And then you see people out there who often are, I don't know where they're coming up with this stuff, but they're often quite flimsy on the science, or they're not evidence-based, or they're saying things that, in my opinion, are harmful or problematic, but they're really good at reaching people. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they actually do it in ways that could be considered unethical within our field. And yet they're often selling the most books, or they have millions and millions of followers. And what they're really good at is making a catchy message and branding themselves.
Right.
And, you know, I think one of the things that upsets me personally, it's partly the effect that they're having on people who are consuming it. If they're saying things, you know, these life hacks and quick fixes and things that are really not helpful. Effective, but also just kind of the unfairness of it.
I know.
You know, I'm like, I
those of us pounding the pavement over here. Yeah.
Yes.
I am going to call out a very famous author because I don't think our little podcast will threaten his well-being.
Yeah.
But Gabor Mate is highly successful. He's written multiple books, and I have not read any of the books. I will say that. But I've listened to him on an interview, and one thing that really got me was how he blamed childhood trauma as the cause for ADHD. And he's a physician. You know, he has the MD after his name. And all I could think about is how many parents hear this, read this, and think, how did I traumatize my child? And take that self-blame. When we have decades of science, there is maybe some evidence of like trauma as a switch, right, for certain symptoms or severity of ADHD. But to blanket that this is the cause is so irresponsible in my mind. So that's a specific example.
Well, and in my opinion, that's just one example of so many where, you know, you could look at the messaging, and if you know the science, you are just thinking, oh, please don't say that. And yet they often have the big books. They have the huge social media followings. There are so many examples of this. And I sometimes have clients come into therapy who are, you know, saying some things where I sit there and think, as a therapist, do I question this? I mean, if it's something that they're finding helpful, I don't really want to be the one to say, well, actually, that's not scientifically
supported
accurate.
by the science. Yeah.
You know, but at the same time, I do want them to beware, and I want them to consider. So yeah, it's an issue. And I think it's one that we could probably talk for hours about, but I know that we are kind of running low on time here. But we did want to call that out. We just wanted to name that as one thing too, that we think it's, you know, it's really important for people to exercise some critical thinking when they are consuming social media and content about mental health. And, you know, on the one hand, it's opening up some really important conversations. It's getting people more access, but also we need people to do this responsibly.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the people who are creating the content sometimes aren't. And so I think as consumers of it and people who are getting this content, we need to do that for ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that loops nicely with our conclusion, which is that we're hoping that even having an episode where we're talking about all of this helps raise awareness and that savvy mind that you were talking about of when we're taking in this media, whether it's for entertainment, relaxation, information, that we're doing it in a way with a little bit of a skeptic's mind.
Yes.
To protect ourselves and enrich our own lives by not falling for all of it.
Exactly. Buyer beware, right? Yeah. Consumer beware. All right, Emily. Well, thank you so much. It was fun to brainstorm and talk to you about this today. And thanks, everybody, for listening.
Yeah. And please, if you have thoughts, we would love to hear it. You can send us an email.
Yes. And share with your friends.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.